Sense and Sensibility, Marianne and Elinor as illustrations of sense and sensibility. There's often a tendency to discuss the two concepts of sense and sensibility as if they are really opposites of one another. But one would have to dispute a little bit that they are absolute opposites of one another. They contrast to some extent with each other, but they're not opposites. And the novel itself actually would confirm this in the way that although there are many differences in Marianne's and Elinor's characters, there are also quite a number of similarities. Elinor is the eldest daughter and significantly the more serious daughter, the one who analyses things more carefully and who is also more responsible both in her sense of duty towards her family, her sense of duty towards Marianne herself as her slightly younger sister, whom she tries to take care of, tries to guide and tries to steer in ways that will be more helpful to Marianne socially and also less risky for Marianne emotionally. Elinor is also responsible in situations of socialising. She's the one who tends to take the more diplomatic response to situations and tries to keep the peace with people, tries to be observant of the duty or obligation that she might be under towards people in a given social situation and not just responding or reacting in terms of her own emotions, which often tends to be Marianne's approach. Marianne is altogether freer in her ideas about how it's appropriate to behave. She thinks that it's quite appropriate really to express her real opinions in a great many situations, or also if she disagrees with something to simply say nothing at all, to block something absolutely by her behaviour if not her spoken word. This is certainly by contrast with Elinor, who aims to keep the peace so much more. But Marianne is generally very lively. She's quite an extrovert character, although, as Elinor points out, she's not a particularly happy or jolly person. That's a different quality, a different characteristic. When Marianne's emotions become roused by anything, she is very freely expressive of them. Her love of music, her love of dance, and this translates also towards her emotions towards people and how she expresses them. She is very overt in displaying to the world around her how she feels about Willoughby. And this was a reasonably dangerous thing for a young woman in this particular social set to do, because if the relationship didn't actually come to fruition, then her reputation had been a little bit damaged. She was no longer so fresh, she was no longer so pure, and this could be detrimental to the marital prospects. Elinor clearly sees an impropriety in the strength of the emotions that Marianne displays for Willoughby in public, the unreservedness of those emotions, and also the lack of restraint in the activities that they undertake. For example, visiting the house at Allenham with Willoughby on his own, going into the house, going around the house with Willoughby on his own, was certainly open to misconstruction and misinterpretation by outsiders who perhaps didn't know Marianne so well. And as the plot unfolds, and as we realise that Willoughby's character is by no means as honourable as it should be, or as it could be, then again we understand more Elinor's qualms about Marianne having been in this situation against the rigorous standards of the day in terms of, you know, a woman's behaviour and, you know, her interactions with the male sex. So that's to discuss quite a number of ways in which Elinor and Marianne are different. There are ways, though, in which they are quite similar. Their appearance is clearly such that it's possible to see that they're sisters. They do look different. Both of them are very attractive young women, but nevertheless, I think from the way in which they're described, we can tell that they are of the same family, they're of the same blood, that they are sisters. They have similarities in their temperaments as well. Both of them, in essence, are actually very private people. Although Marianne, in believing that she's going to marry Willoughby and that the affection that exists between them will become a public thing by dint of their marriage, a public contract of togetherness. Marianne is, though, for the most part, actually really quite private about who she is. And she feels very much that her family's affairs are private as well. She feels strongly on Elinor's behalf that prying into Elinor's love life at the dining table at the Middletons is most inappropriate. Elinor, as well, guards her privacy and her family's privacy quite closely. Both sisters are very intelligent. They are intellectual. Their interests are quite intellectual. They both enjoy poetry. They both enjoy music. They both enjoy and appreciate drawing and art. And so in these ways we see that they are quite similar again. You know, one description of Marianne quite early on allies her abilities and Elinor's abilities with one another, and also talks of Marianne's qualities in a way that we can see that she and Elinor are very much of an intellectual level. Marianne's abilities were in many respects quite equal to Elinor's. She was sensible and clever, so here sensible relating to sense, being the adjective for sense because it's married with clever. But eager in everything, her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. The resemblance between her and her mother was strikingly great. So it's this, in many respects, absence of prudence and the sense that her emotions have no moderation, which is where she and Elinor are different. But in many other key respects, being sensible and clever, they are similar. Also, although Marianne chooses not to engage in social chit-chat and sort of trivial pleasantries or white lies, unlike Elinor, who is more inclined to stay as truthful as she possibly can, but to maintain that very diplomatic and more sociable front. Nonetheless, Marianne is sociable. Like Elinor, she likes to get out and to meet people. This is important to her. And both she and Elinor have quite stringent judgments, both of them, about how other people behave, the quality of their behaviour, the level of their sincerity, and also their decorum. They coincide, both of them, quickly in whether or not they think someone is vulgar. So there are these many similarities between Elinor and Marianne. Although Marianne is very, if not highly or extremely sensitive with regard to her own emotions and the importance of them being freely expressed as they truly are in the moment, she's a lot less sensitive or sensible of other people's emotions, unlike Elinor, who feels quite vividly how another person might be feeling or suffering in a social situation. She's often very acutely aware of how Mrs. Jennings might feel with regard to the way in which Marianne treats her. Elinor also has sort of more sense of obligation or duty to the kindness that Sir John Middleton has shown towards her and Marianne, and indeed the whole family. Feels that he has something due to him on account of that. Whereas Marianne has no sensibility in these directions. It's really all about how Marianne feels, actually. When it comes to being, though, clever and behaving with sense, that sense of being sensible, Marianne does have some shortcomings. She takes things on surface value. If someone says something and they express it out loud in their words, then she believes what they're saying. If they act in a certain way, behave in a certain way, then she believes that that's who they are. That's all that there is to it. It doesn't occur to her that beneath Willoughby's dashing exterior there might be a more calculated, more determined side to his character, in which he will make decisions quite calculatedly to his own advantage. When she looks at Colonel Brandon and she sees a man who has suffered disappointment and sadness in his life, and who bears the marks of that, so that he's more subdued in society, she assumes that this subdued exterior is all that there is to him. Elinor is more perceptive. She doesn't simply go by what people actively say. She also goes by what it is that people omit to say. So with regard to Elinor and Willoughby and Marianne's relationship, Elinor is very observant of what it is that they have not said. They have not confirmed to their family and friends that they're engaged, although in many ways they appear to be acting as if there is such an understanding between them. But what has not been said, as opposed to just the overt exterior of their behaviour, is something that Elinor notes and thinks is of importance. Her mother, who, like Marianne, lacks prudence, despite being older than Elinor, also does not see the importance of that which has been omitted. And as a result, Marianne is facilitated in going deeper and deeper into a situation which ultimately leads to heartbreak. Elinor tends to observe perhaps what people say, but then to note that their actions are not always in consonance with what it is that they have expressed. So she observes these disparities. Nevertheless, despite this deeper, more reflective way of analysing people, Elinor makes her fair share of mistakes as well. There's absolutely no evidence to confirm in her mind that the lock of hair in Edward Ferrars' ring is hers, but she assumes that it is because she believes that he's in love with her. Again, she believes that he's in love with her, yet he's not actually approaching her over this. He's not being open about it. or active about it, and she puts this down to the influence of his mother on his life. Whereas, of course, in reality, given the fact that he overrides his mother completely in the end, it's a lot more to do with the fact that he's already engaged to somebody else. So, Eleanor's sense doesn't always mean that she makes the right decisions, either. The contrasts between Elinor's behaviours and Marianne's behaviours are perhaps to be most vividly seen in such scenes as when Marianne meets Willoughby at the party in town, and he is very dismissive of her and essentially rejects her, certainly rejects her at the level of a lover. Marianne is overcome with emotion and sees no reason to hide how she's feeling, whereas Elinor feels that it's extremely important that Marianne does not give way to such excessive emotion in public. Again, one could say it's typical codes of the gentry, typical codes of that level of Britishness that, again, is perceived across the world as being typically British. The understatement, the reservedness, that sense of, not really expressing the depth of feeling or emotion that actually pertains to the inner reality. It's a sort of standard gentry, standard code of behaviour. However, one could also argue that Marianne was the one in that particular situation who was really suffering. Yet at the point when Elinor discovers that Edward is actually engaged, or that he's not free to love her or to be her lover, of course she absolutely represses her emotion, tries to hide it absolutely as much as she possibly can, and where she thinks that she might have given herself away slightly to Lucy, she actively seeks to reopen the discussion of Lucy's engagement to Edward in order to prove that she doesn't feel anything about it, she's absolutely impartial. The truth is, of course, within the fiction of the novel, that Lucy Steele is perfectly well aware of the fact that Elinor has feelings for Edward and that Edward has feelings for Elinor, and that Lucy's highly sophisticated revelation of her secret to Elinor and continued embroilment of Elinor in that discussion is merely a sophisticated plot to try and see off Elinor as a rival. The novel doesn't really ask us to make any absolute decision between the respective merits of being on the side of sense or on the side of sensibility. Our sympathies for the two sisters are fairly even, and a lot of the story is seen through the eyes of Elinor, so perhaps there is a preference for sense ultimately as well. Marianne realises that life is probably easier when it's guided more by sense than excessive sensibility. Nevertheless, it's not attractive, I don't think, in Elinor that she is so deeply reserved, that she withholds so much emotional confidence from her family and also from her sister, in whose confidence she is so openly held. We see both sisters happily settled at the end of the novel. And so again, there is very little value judgment between the two. There's a necessity to have a balance between the two, I think, that the novel seems to arrive at that point. So there is development. Marianne has considerable amount of development. She probably does go through more emotional development than Elinor. Elinor has to learn patience, perhaps more than she needs to learn self-regulation. By today's standards, though, I think we might think that Elinor does need to liven up just a little bit, probably. With the minor major characters, again, we're asked to evaluate them as well in terms of contrasting qualities and characteristics. There's less personal development than occurs in the stories of Elinor and Marianne. But if we think that Edward pays court to one sister, he's not able to because of a prior engagement. Willoughby pays court to the other sister, he's not able to proceed with that because of a prior engagement or because of prior predetermined needs in his own life that he is not going to contravene. And also because he's angered the person that he's due to inherit from, so he has to ensure his financial welfare from another perspective, i.e. marriage. But we see Willoughby, who purports freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of opinions, freedom from conventions. He purports all of this at the start of the novel, whereas Edward is under the thumb of his mother, unable to express himself, can't decide what he wants to do with his life, isn't able to tell Elinor that he loves her. But by the end of the novel, we see that Willoughby is trapped in a marriage which makes him unhappy, whether a marriage is contracted for reasons of affection or whether it's contracted as exactly that, a contract between two people. The nature of marriage is such that the two lives are tied together and it's really inescapable. So it's a slightly faulty calculation. He's trapped in the marriage, he's discontented with the marriage, he has succumbed to convention at the most businesslike and formal legal level, whereas Edward throws it all up. He throws up his inheritance, he walks away from the system of primogeniture, he chooses his own career, which is really his vocation, to be a minister of the church, and he marries the woman whom he loves, and as a result is happy. In fact, in many respects, he moves towards sensibility and actually takes up a life in which he is happy and Elinor is happy as well. It's not just his happiness that he ensures hers as well. So we see in these two contrasting characters actually a more clear-cut moral lesson. Willoughby's main problem is that he is actually deceitful and he actually lives outside of his means, more than that he's not sensible enough or not sensitive enough. Colonel Brandon begins the novel as a slow man, a man of property and a man of duty, and he's ridiculed by the young lovers, he's ridiculed by Elinor and Willoughby. Willoughby says, what does Willoughby say? Willoughby says of Colonel Brandon, "Brandon is just the kind of man," said Willoughby one day when they were talking of him together, "whom everybody speaks well of and nobody cares about, whom all are delighted to see and nobody remembers to talk to." And there's quite a strong irony in that, because of course this is ultimately the situation that Willoughby lands himself in with the majority of the acquaintance of the Dashwood family. Sir John, in fact, refuses to speak to Willoughby when he meets him in the street. It's only because he realises that Willoughby is actually very unhappy at knowing that Marianne is ill that he softens a little bit and does speak to Willoughby. But Colonel Brandon, as I say, is ridiculed by the young lovers. But his passion for Marianne bides its time. He proves himself to be an honourable man. And as I say in one of the other videos, he actually is a man of action, but his actions are always carried out for some purpose. I mean, he leaves Sir John's house and the park there rather suddenly with a concealed purpose, which is of course to go and rescue his ward Eliza. He fetches Marianne's mother when Marianne is at death's door, rides off into the night in bad weather, you know, doesn't care about anything about that. Something has to be done, he'll see it through. He's a very determined man, and in some respects that determination leads him ultimately to win Marianne. Yes, in the end he retains his fortune and his status, and he's maybe not so dull after all. You know, Willoughby doesn't maintain his fortune. He maintains his status, although he's diminished because of his lack of honourable behaviour. He's not cast out of society, unlike a woman in his situation would have been. But Colonel Brandon gets married and he's happily married. He lives a fulfilled life, whereas Willoughby's life is unfulfilling. So again, there is a distinct set of values that comes forward in the development here, in the way in which the plot, the outcome of the plot, endorses one character over another. And it's the honesty of Colonel Brandon, the integrity of Colonel Brandon, and his value systems, when he knows what is important to take action on and when action is merely trivial and a waste of time, a waste of energy, and potentially a waste of money, I suppose.